Hi, my name is Heiko. As was said before, I am a UX design manager at Google. And I want to talk to you a little bit about my fascination for cities. I grew up in the countryside in northern Germany, so I'm actually a bit of a country bumpkin. So maybe that's why I was kind of like always longing for like the urban environment. But after high school, I lived in Hamburg for a couple of years. After Hamburg, I moved to Taipei, and I lived in Taipei for, I think, almost 2 years as well. After Taipei, I moved to Melbourne, and lived in Melbourne for 10 years. So I'm catching up on my country bumpkinness. Sydney for 5 years, and I moved to New York, I think about 4 years ago, and I'm very happy to be here. So I guess one thing that I sort of noticed as I've been traveling around is like this feeling of feeling lost in the city. You come to a new place, you might not speak the language, or you might not, have any friends or any connections. And so I've been starting to wonder, like, what that sort of transition is from feeling lost in the city to making a city feel like home, and like what the sort of steps or the sequencing is for you to feel like more connected to the places that you live in. Favorite movie, by the way, too. So in my spare time, I'm sort of like to take pictures and maybe sort of subconsciously, like through my photography, I've been trying to like answer some of those questions around like, what is the character of the city? What do the locals take pride in? Where do locals hang out, and what is the character of the locals, if you will? And what is the relationship between people and places? What happens at the intersection of buildings? How does life kind of play out? Now, I guess those types of questions have become more relevant because I'm now working for Google Maps, and I sort of think about this sort of stuff more or less full time. My team's mission is to organize the world's experiences and make them accessible to you. So whenever you use Google Maps and you look up a bar or a restaurant or something to do in New York or elsewhere, that's probably something that my team has touched. Now, just a few weeks ago, I was in a workshop with a team from Sidewalk Labs. Have you heard of Sidewalk Labs? Some nods. They're an Alphabet company that is basically a urban design smart city startup that is owned by Alphabet, parent company of Google. And we're talking about this idea of like how you would actually measure a sense of belonging, either to create new spaces, to create like new environments, new cities, or like in digital sense to like better measure like how people actually feel a level of connectedness in the spaces that they live in. So, we're sort of like toying with the idea, so what factors contribute to your sense of belonging? And could your sense of belonging be mapped? So the timing of this was quite nice because I basically decided that I might just look at my last 4 years in New York and kind of understand and analyze like what my time in New York kind of shaped out to be, and like what spaces I kind of hung out in. So it's basically a massive visualization exercise, and this is like very rough, so I apologize if it's a little bit unpolished, unfinished, but I was just excited to share with you how I was able to kind of push it, I guess. Okay, so just to kind of zoom in, I live in the West Village. I used to work at Huge, just around the corner from here. It's a design agency, like just over there. And now I work at Google, which is in Chelsea. So I guess that's sort of like, just zooming in on New York or Manhattan like a little bit. I had to think about like the sort of apps that I would have used as part of my like journey of discovery. So this is kind of like, like just like I guess an example set in terms of like the apps or the services that you would use to, discover places, to like actually go and navigate to them. Obviously, Google Maps hopefully plays a big part in that. But then also the apps that you would use in order to remember or share like your findings or your experiences with your friends. Now, I didn't have time to mine all my data, but I was kind of thinking about, okay, what data do I actually have available, like in terms of like my personal information? So it kind of goes from qual to quant, right? So like at the bottom you have like, maybe it's interesting to think about like the experiences or the memories I would have had, which is obviously much more difficult to kind of quantify. And then at the top you have, like places visited, frequency of visits, photos taken, photos posted. So basically, this is sort of my last 4 years in New York. About 270 check-ins, 50 at significant locations, so your iPhone tracks where you're going, so it kind of tells you the places that you go to more than once. About 6,000 pictures and 200 photos posted to Instagram. So when you put that on a map, so there are my check-ins. Maybe unsurprisingly, there's a bit of a cluster in the West Village, and then there's like a bit of a cluster, I guess, in sort of, the East Village. I like this dot here. I highly recommend you go there. It's a floating bar that is owned by the New York Yacht Club called the Honorable William Wall. On a summer's day, it's amazing. You should check it out. Okay, so here are my significant locations. And again, maybe not that surprising. The largest dot there is where I live. I used to spend a lot of time in Dunmore because I used to go to work here. Now I spend a lot of time in Chelsea at the Google office. But then there's other two dots, like sort of at, I guess, 5 o'clock and 8 o'clock are parks. I have a dog, and I take my dog to, walk to either Washington Square Park, or there's a dog run on the Hudson, basically at least 2 or 3 times a week. So that's why, again, there's sort of, I guess, significant places for me. Photos taken, again, lots of pictures like around home. What I thought was quite interesting is the dots on the water. So I must have taken a ferry from Manhattan to Jersey at some point in time. And I also remember taking a ferry ride. There was like an architectural boat cruise that basically took me all the way down the Hudson and into the East River. So you can kind of see those dotted lines. And then the 4 dots on the far left was actually me flying over Manhattan in a plane, which I didn't realize. I was like, what was I doing there? I was on a plane. Okay, great. And then finally, these are my Instagram posts. Fairly even distributed, maybe not that insightful, but still kind of interesting to map out. Now, when you put this stuff together, so I'm basically now looking at overlaying this information. So check-ins, significant locations, photos, and then Instagram post. I guess you can kind of see that there's a bit of a heat map, a bit of a smear from like the West Village down to like Soho-ish, and then like up into the East Village, and then in Dunmore again. By the way, I just did this in Photoshop. This is not scientific at all. I'm just like using a brush and like smearing it. Okay, just full disclosure. So I guess that's kind of interesting, but like overall, I guess the data is pretty, it's helpful, kind of good to understand like how things map out, but it's pretty rough, and it kind of lacks like richness, right? So I was kind of thinking back to a few books and some literature that I read. So I don't know if you heard of Jane Jacobs. She's amazing, and she wrote a book, The Life and Death of Great American Cities, has become kind of like a cornerstone of like urban design literature. She lived in the West Village actually, and fought the city putting a major traffic fair through Washington Square Park. And the city was also going to clear blocks in the West Village. It was called slum clearance, to basically build these like high-rise apartment towers. She rallied the community to like fight that, to protect like the heritage and the integrity of the community. But the one thing that I kind of took away and that really inspired me, like reading the book, was this idea of what she calls eyes on the street. She writes very passionately about the role of the sidewalk. And that life actually happens on the sidewalk, where people talk or hang out, where kids play, and so that's a really important attribute for community life. And so I thought it was kind of interesting to think about this idea of like observing the daily theater of the street, and how it kind of changes like throughout the day. So I thought that I might be able to use that in terms of my exploration. Now, the other book that I kind of read is by an urban sociologist called Ray Oldenburg, and he wrote this book called The Great Good Place, and he's talking about the importance and the relevance of what he calls third places. So third places are not your home and not your work. They're sort of gathering places that you can go to hang out, to kind of get away from your work colleagues and from your family, where you can just like happily have a drink or like meet other strangers, and that is really like at the foundation of a healthy civic or community life as well. So I thought, that's kind of interesting. So the insight here was that maybe a sense of belonging is created in third places where you get to interact and converse with other locals or with strangers, right? So I thought it would be interesting for me to map out like what my third places look like. So I hope I won't bore you with the details of my personal life, but I thought I'd give you a bit of a rundown. So Jack's Brew Coffee is where I get my coffee every morning. This is a bodega that I kind of go to pretty much every day, and I've met friends with the guys that run it. That's where I get my haircut. So I go there every 3 weeks. So I talk to Yuri, the hairdresser, for about 45 minutes. This is where I walk my dog, Rosie, pretty much every day, more or less. This is where I get my bagels and breakfast on the weekends. They're the cleaners that live across the street from us. Turns out that the owner is from Taiwan, so now she's forcing me to practice my Chinese, which is terrifying. So now I go less. Village Vanguard is an amazing jazz club, and whenever I go there, I just feel really part of the neighborhood because it's been there a very long time. It's just really like ancient and like just amazing, and the music is great. There's an amazing bookstore. Joseph Land is a great bar where we often kind of hang out and drink. That's another great bar. Late night pizza, very important. You know, you come home on a Saturday night and you're so hungry, so you grab a slice. Famous Chinese, Western Chinese food place in the Greenwich Village. Another pizza place. Local grocery store, and another bar, and then I think finally there's another dog one. So that's sort of my third places that I kind of go to and hang out like a lot, every week more or less. And then the other thing that I was thinking about is, I guess, like from the Jane Jacobs perspective, like the sort of the walks, like the pavements, the sidewalks that I feel really comfortable with, right? So like this is kind of mapping out like the walks that I kind of take on a frequent basis as well. And when you put that together, I guess you have really like what's my hood, more or less. Like this is sort of like my area. And I guess what's interesting there, if I kind of put it in comparison with the sort of more quantitative data, that it is a much more sort of zeroed in visualization of like, you know, the areas that I actually call home. So I guess it's interesting to kind of balance like the more qualitative assessment in terms of like how I feel about like moving in the city compared to like, you know, my check-ins, my pictures posted, but there's certainly like a relationship between those two, right? So you might ask yourself, what does your map of the city look like? What does your hood look like? So I figured, I'm not a data scientist, but why not come up with a formula, at least try? So maybe your sense of belonging in the city is determined by how many times you visit a place, how much time you spend there per visit. But then I think what's maybe more important is the number and quality of interactions that you have. I suppose the joy that you derive from observing street life, where you kind of enjoy just like watching people and taking pleasure in like seeing how like the street theater plays out, and then ultimately good times, right? So this is the last slide, but I hope that you maybe take away some insights or inspiration in terms of like creating experiences that help design to shape local communities and to enhance people's sense of belonging in the city. Thank you.
First of all, I also get my hair cut at Gino's Barberia. How crushed were you when Mateo left? Anyway, let's open up for Q&A. We can talk about haircuts at any time. So just raise your hand if you have a question. One thing I'd love to start off with, we got two over here. Can you comment on the design stack that Google uses? Like what software tools do you and your team use to help make your work possible?
How technical do you want me to get?
Very?
Okay.
Moderately.
We use Sketch a lot. So like my team is a team of UX designers. So we predominantly use Sketch, experimenting with Figma, just because it allows you to kind of collaborate like in real time. So that's kind of appealing. I personally use a lot of email, spreadsheets, Google Slides. That's like my misfortune, I suppose. But I think I would say predominantly it's Sketch for designing.
Hi, simple question. Do you star places on your Google Maps? And did that help you with your data?
All the time.
Okay.
All the time. Like if you looked at my actual Google map, you can't see Manhattan. That's the problem. We're trying to fix it.
Another question back here. Yeah, I'm wondering how you might use your information with this sense of trying to optimize or maximize belonging in a place. And not just what it tells you, but like how do you action that information?
That's a very good question. I think what I would like to do is to like think about. I guess what this visualization is showing you is that my area is not bound by geopolitical areas. So it's not like right just in the West Village or just in Chelsea. It kind of like crosses different paths. So I think it'd be interesting to think about ways that, like through maybe at Google Maps or maybe just generally speaking, to find ways to enhance or to allow people to find their spaces, especially as you kind of, say if you're moving to a new city, like what tools would there be that would allow you to kind of hone in on the parts of a city or parts of an area that you might be interested in. And I don't think that it's actually about sort of finding bars or shops or, sort of more like commercial ventures, and that it actually might be more around like, hey, this is a street that you might really enjoy, or here's a park that you might really want to enjoy. So I'm going to try and weave some of this thinking into my work, but I haven't quite figured out yet how.
I'm just wondering how you make this work differently for different people. There was an excellent article in The Guardian today about a suburb in Vienna that is designed by women for women. Every street is named after a woman. And it's designed very different from other parts of Vienna that are designed by men for men, which is traditionally how cities are built. So just sort of that, how do you make sure that this works for everybody?
It probably won't. But I think what I took away from Jane Jacobs is that urban design and city development should ideally be shaped by the communities that live there. And I think some of the mistakes that happened in the past was that you had this sort of top-down approach to like city development where people would literally look at like a map, like a miniature version of a town, and then just like wipe out blocks to put freeways down. Whereas I think what she was really advocating for, and what I really believe in myself too, is like to have it ultimately more user-centered and more from the ground up, because people who live there ideally will have a really good understanding of like, what the area is about, like what types of facilities should be built. So I think there's something there on like, I guess, a new approach to urban design that is much more human-centered as opposed to top-down.
One question from me as well, and then I'd love to hand the mic to you as well. You get to work on products that are used at a scale that few other people in the world are working on, and I'd love for you to comment on how you test design or product changes with your user base and then decide to roll them out.
It's a very slow process. I think there are a lot of iterations, and that was probably like one of the biggest like changes for me. I used to work in an agency before where I think you sort of like, you came in, you worked on a vision or on a transformation project, then you'd sort of like maybe work on a detailed design phase or two, and then you'd move on to the next client. Whereas I think at Google, it's much more about being there for the long run. So innovation doesn't, it appears to me that innovation doesn't happen overnight, and there's no like sort of like big bang releases, and that it is really like constantly testing all the time. So even like, like on Google Maps right now, there's probably, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8 experiments running that maybe some of you get to see. And there's constantly data being collected to work out, whether, we'll introduce a new feature, or whether like a button should get moved, or like a new design should get introduced. So like it takes a lot of time to kind of stay on top of like all the different moving pieces, because it is so complex, and because we are working on a product that gets used globally, that millions of people get to see every day.
Wonderful, thoughtful presentation. I've lived in the West Village my whole life, back from when Fifth Avenue was two ways, and I've traveled a lot. And one thing that would be very helpful to me in kind of looking back at things is the ability to search the Google history of where I've been. You can kind of see stuff when you happen to land there, but try to recreate the memories of, oh, I'm trying to remember this bar somewhere in Vienna. And I know the data's there, but it seems to be impossible to get to. So anything that can help that process would be great.
I think there's a feature called Google Timeline, and I going to sit next to you. I'm going to show it to you where it lives. It's not searchable. Okay, good idea.
We're doing user research here live. Go, one last question.
This one's more out of curiosity, but of your most popular check-ins, which one surprised you the most?
Okay, so there's a German Hofbrauhaus in the West Village, and I checked and I had 10 check-ins there. So I guess maybe it's just a piece of home.
I love it. What an ending. Thank you so much. That was amazing.